In the year 307, in a cave outside Thebes, a young man named Antony gave away everything he owned, walked into the Egyptian desert, and began a battle against his own body that would last 85 years, 2,000 miles away. In the gardens of Athens, philosophers were teaching that pleasure was not the enemy of the good life, but its very definition. These two visions of human flourishing could not be more opposed. Antony, who would become the founder of Christian monasticism, spent decades fighting what he called demons, supernatural forces he believed worked through his own physical desires. He fasted until his body withered. He denied himself sleep, comfort, human companionship. When people came to learn from him, they found a man who had transformed self-denial into a form of spiritual warfare. Meanwhile, in Athens, a philosopher named Epicurus had established a different kind of community. In his garden, students gathered not to punish their bodies but to understand pleasure itself, to distinguish between desires that brought lasting contentment and those that promised much but delivered only emptiness and craving. Tonight we will explore one of philosophy's most enduring tensions, the question of whether human flourishing comes from embracing pleasure or rejecting it entirely. We will travel from ancient Greece to medieval monasteries, from Epicurean gardens to Buddhist meditation halls, examining why this debate has captivated human minds for over 2 millennia and what it reveals about the fundamental puzzle of how to live. You will meet Aristippus of Cyrene, who scandalized Athens by declaring that only immediate bodily pleasure mattered. You will encounter the Buddha, who tried both luxury and starvation before discovering what he called the middle way. You will walk with desert fathers who saw their own flesh as the enemy, and with Enlightenment philosophers who tried to calculate pleasure with mathematical precision. This is not merely ancient history. The question these thinkers wrestled with remains alive in every choice between indulgence and restraint, comfort and discipline, the path of least resistance and the harder road that promises something more. Consider what made Antony walk into that desert. He was not born into poverty or hardship. He came from a prosperous family in Egypt, a young man with every reason to enjoy the pleasures available to him. But at the age of 20, according to his biographer Athanasius, Anthony heard a passage from the Gospel of Matthew read aloud in church. "If you would be perfect, go sell what you possess and give to the poor, and you will have treasure in heaven." Most people who heard these words nodded and went home to their comfortable lives. Anthony took them literally. He distributed his inheritance, left his village, and began experimenting with self-denial in ways that would have seemed extreme even to other Christians of his time. He ate only bread and water, and only after sunset. He slept on the bare ground. When these practices became too comfortable, he moved further into the wilderness, eventually taking up residence in an abandoned Roman fort where he lived alone for 20 years. The paradox that drove Antony, and thousands who followed him into the desert, was this. They believed that denying the body would liberate something deeper, something more fundamentally themselves than their physical desires. Pleasure, in their view, was not harmless enjoyment, but a chain that bound the soul to the material world. Every moment of bodily satisfaction, they argued, strengthened that chain. Only through systematic denial could one break free. This was not mere willpower or self-control, it was metaphysical conviction. They believed the body and its pleasures belonged to a lower order of reality, one that was fundamentally at odds with the spiritual realm they sought to reach. Now consider what Epicurus was teaching in Athens around the same time Anthony's philosophical ancestors were developing the ideas that would shape Christian asceticism. Epicurus, who lived from 341 to 270 before the Common Era, founded his school in 307, exactly 658 years before Anthony began his desert vigil. In the garden where Epicurus taught, above the entrance, there was supposedly an inscription, "Stranger, here you will do well to tarry. Here our highest good is pleasure." But the pleasure Epicurus had in mind would have disappointed anyone expecting perpetual feasting and sensual indulgence. He lived on bread and water most days, occasionally supplemented with cheese, which he considered a luxury. His famous garden parties, which scandalized conventional Athenians, consisted mainly of conversation among friends. The radical claim Epicurus made was not that pleasure meant endless indulgence, but that it meant something far more subtle, the absence of pain in the body and disturbance in the mind. You might recognize these competing visions in your own life. The voice that says you should resist temptation, build discipline, deny yourself immediate gratification for some higher purpose. And the voice that asks why we should not enjoy what life offers, why suffering should be noble while pleasure is suspect. This is not a debate between self-control and self-indulgence, though it is often misunderstood that way. It is a question about the fundamental nature of human flourishing. Is there something in us that transcends bodily experience, something that can only be reached by denying physical desire? Or is the body not a prison to escape, but the very ground of a life well lived? The philosophers we will encounter tonight took these questions seriously enough to stake their entire lives on particular answers. Some nearly starved themselves to death in pursuit of spiritual purity. Others built elaborate systems attempting to measure and maximize pleasure scientifically. Neither path was casual or unreflective. Both were attempts to solve what may be the most personal philosophical question anyone can ask. Given that I have this body, these desires, this finite life, how should I live? The debate between hedonism and asceticism has never been settled because it touches something fundamental about human existence itself. We are creatures who can imagine perfection while experiencing limitation, who can conceive of eternal truths while inhabiting decaying bodies, who can choose immediate pleasure or deferred gratification, sensory delight or contemplative transcendence. Every major philosophical and religious tradition has had to reckon with this tension. Some, like the Cyrenaics, embraced pleasure so completely they shocked even other hedonists. Others, like certain Christian mystics and Hindu ascetics, pursued bodily denial to extremes that seem incomprehensible to modern sensibilities. Most traditions found themselves somewhere in between, trying to honor both body and spirit, pleasure and discipline, the human and the transcendent. To understand how this debate began in Western philosophy, we must travel to ancient Greece in the 5th and 4th centuries before the Common Era, where one man dared to claim that pleasure was not merely acceptable, but the very purpose of existence. Think for a moment about what happens when you experience pleasure, a meal that satisfies genuine hunger, the warmth of sunlight after a cold morning, the relief when chronic pain finally subsides. Your body signals satisfaction, your mind, for that moment, quiets. There is a sense of rightness, of things being as they should be. Now consider the opposite, the deliberate choice to refuse these satisfactions, fasting when food is available, remaining in discomfort when comfort is within reach, denying yourself not because you must, but because you believe denial itself has value. These are not hypothetical exercises. Throughout history, millions of people have organized their entire lives around one of these two principles, convinced that their choice represented not mere preference, but fundamental truth about human existence. The question of whether to pursue pleasure or deny it sits at the intersection of philosophy, religion, psychology, and lived experience. It is not abstract in the way that debates about the nature of time or the existence of universals can be abstract. You cannot avoid taking a position on it, even if that position is unreflective or inconsistent. Every time you choose between indulgence and restraint, every time you decide whether to satisfy a desire or resist it, you are enacting an answer to this question. The philosophers we will encounter tonight simply made explicit what most people navigate intuitively, and they followed the logic of their positions to conclusions most of us would find extreme. What makes this question so persistent is that both sides can marshal compelling evidence. The hedonist observes that pleasure is self-evidently good. When you are in pain, you want it to stop. When you experience pleasure, you want it to continue. This seems like basic empirical fact, the kind of knowledge written into the structure of consciousness itself. Moreover, pleasure appears to be what motivates virtually all human behavior. Even apparently altruistic or ascetic choices can be understood as pursuing some form of satisfaction, whether it is the pleasure of moral righteousness, the relief of a quieted conscience, or the anticipation of heavenly reward. If we are honest about what actually drives us, the hedonist argues, we discover that pleasure is not one good among many, but the good toward which all others point. The ascetic response is equally powerful. Watch what happens, they say, when someone organizes their life entirely around pursuing pleasure. The drug addict experiences intense pleasure, yet we recognize that life has diminished rather than enhanced. The person who indulges every appetite often ends up enslaved by those appetites, less free rather than more. Pleasure proves to be an unreliable guide precisely because it is so compelling in the moment. It pulls us toward immediate satisfaction at the expense of longer-term flourishing. More fundamentally, the ascetic argues, there is something in human beings that transcends bodily experience entirely. Our capacity for rational thought, moral reasoning, aesthetic appreciation, spiritual insight, these seem independent of and often opposed to physical pleasure. The highest human achievements, whether in philosophy, art, science, or spirituality, typically require discipline, sacrifice, and the subordination of bodily desires to higher aims. Perhaps what makes us distinctly human is precisely our ability to override the body's demands. Different cultures have answered this question in radically different ways, and their answers shaped everything from social structures to individual psychology. Ancient Greece produced sophisticated philosophical hedonism alongside rigorous Stoic discipline. India developed both the sensual aesthetics of the Kama Sutra and the extreme renunciation of Jain monks who would not even swallow their own saliva. Medieval Christianity elevated virginity and self-mortification to the highest spiritual status, while Islamic philosophy preserved and extended Greek hedonist texts that Europe had forgotten. Even within single traditions, the pendulum swung back and forth. Christianity moved from desert asceticism to Renaissance celebration of the body, then to Puritan restriction, then to modern therapeutic culture that often treats pleasure as not just acceptable but obligatory for psychological health. These different answers were never merely theoretical. They determined how people ate, whether they married, how they understood their bodies, what they considered virtuous or shameful, how they structured their days, what they hoped for after death. A Cyrenaic hedonist in 4th century Greece, convinced that only immediate pleasure mattered, lived a completely different life than a Christian anchorite in 4th century Egypt, equally convinced that the body was an enemy to be conquered. Both were intelligent, reflective people responding to what they understood as the fundamental facts of existence. That they reached opposite conclusions suggests the question itself may be more complex than it first appears. The relationship between bodily experience and philosophical truth remains contested precisely because we cannot step outside our bodies to evaluate them neutrally. Every argument about pleasure or asceticism is made by someone who has a body, who experiences desire, who knows both satisfaction and frustration. The hedonist who claims pleasure is the highest good is experiencing that claim, not just thinking it abstractly. The ascetic who insists we must transcend the body is still feeling hunger when they fast, still experiencing the discomfort they claim leads to higher consciousness. Neither can offer a view from nowhere, an assessment of human nature that is not itself shaped by embodied experience. This creates a philosophical puzzle with profound practical implications. If our conclusions about how to live are inevitably shaped by our current state of desire, satisfaction, discipline, or denial, how can we trust any of them? The person in the midst of pleasure naturally believes pleasure is good. The person who has successfully denied desire for long enough often comes to experience that denial as liberating rather than restrictive. Are they discovering truths about human nature, or merely rationalizing their current state? And if we cannot answer that question with certainty, on what basis do we choose between these competing visions of the good life? The philosophers we will encounter took these questions seriously enough to stake everything on their answers. They were not simply describing what people do, but prescribing what people should do, often in the face of powerful social pressure to do otherwise. Their conclusions shaped centuries of human self-understanding, for better and for worse. Some of their insights remain valuable today. Others now seem obviously mistaken, though it is worth asking whether future generations will judge our own answers with similar skepticism. To understand how this debate began in Western philosophy, we must travel to ancient Greece, where one man dared to claim that pleasure was not merely acceptable, but the very purpose of existence. Imagine being 20 years old in Athens during the final decades of the 5th century before the Common Era, sitting in a room with Socrates, listening to him dissect every comfortable assumption about justice and virtue and the good life. Most students who encountered Socrates left those conversations believing that wisdom required struggle, that virtue demanded discipline, that the examined life was one of careful self-restraint. But one student drew exactly the opposite conclusion. His name was Aristippus, and he came from Cyrene, a prosperous Greek colony on the North African coast, famous for its wine and its liberal attitudes. Where others heard Socrates teach that knowledge of the good would make you good, Aristippus heard something different, that we can only truly know our own immediate experiences, and that the most immediate, most undeniable experience of goodness is pleasure itself. Aristippus was not like the other students. He did not dress in simple clothes or affect poverty as a sign of philosophical seriousness. He wore expensive garments, associated with courtesans, and had no shame about being paid for his teaching. According to the later biographical tradition, when someone criticized him for paying 50 drachmas to a prostitute, Aristippus replied that he would pay even more for the pleasure and would think nothing of it. When asked why he alone among Socrates' students pursued wealth and luxury, he supposedly answered that Socrates himself would have chosen these things if he had known they were good. This was not mere provocation. It was the foundation of an entirely new philosophy. The Cyrenaic school that Aristippus founded in his home city proposed something that seemed, to most Greeks, either obviously true or obviously insane depending on how carefully you thought about it. Their central claim was simple: pleasure is the only intrinsic good, pain is the only intrinsic evil, and everything else is morally neutral. Not virtue, not knowledge, not honor, not even happiness in some abstract sense. Only pleasure, and specifically pleasure felt in the present moment, had value in itself. But the Cyrenaics were careful thinkers, and they made important distinctions. They did not claim that all pleasures were equal, or that one should pursue every possible pleasure without discrimination. They distinguished between two types of bodily motion that produce feeling. Rough motion, they said, produces pain. Smooth motion produces pleasure. Absence of motion produces neither pleasure nor pain, a state they considered neutral rather than good. This might sound abstract, but it had radical implications. It meant that pleasure was not merely the absence of pain, as some philosophers claimed. It was a positive sensation, a distinct and definite experience of bodily smoothness, of things going well in the flesh. And for the Cyrenaics, it was specifically bodily pleasure that mattered most. Mental pleasures, they argued, were derivative, dependent on memory or anticipation, and therefore less certain, less immediate, less real than the pleasure of the senses. You might take pleasure in remembering a beautiful sunset or anticipating a future feast, but these were pale reflections compared to the actual sensation of warmth on your skin or rich flavor on your tongue. The present bodily moment was the only moment that truly existed, and therefore the only moment that could contain real value. This led to what seemed like a paradoxical position. The Cyrenaics believed that only present pleasure mattered, which might suggest wild impulsiveness, but they also advocated for practical wisdom in choosing pleasures. Why? Because the ability to distinguish which present actions will produce pleasure rather than pain requires experience and judgment. If you eat until you are sick, the immediate pleasure of eating is outweighed by the immediate pain of nausea. If you drink so much wine that you cannot walk, the pleasure of intoxication is interrupted by the pain of losing control. The wise hedonist, according to Aristippus, is not the person who denies every pleasure out of fear of consequences, but the person who has learned through experience which pleasures are reliable and which are traps. But here is where the Cyrenaic position became genuinely radical. They did not believe that you should refrain from a pleasure today to secure a greater pleasure tomorrow, because tomorrow does not exist. It is only an idea, a projection of the mind. Only this present moment, this present sensation, has reality. Future pleasure is a phantom, and to sacrifice present pleasure for future gain is to trade something real for something imaginary. The wise person, they argued, remains completely autonomous over pleasure, enjoying it when it comes without becoming enslaved to it, capable of taking it or leaving it, never dependent, never attached. You can see why this philosophy was considered dangerous. It seemed to undermine every social bond, every long-term commitment, every sacrifice for the future. If only present pleasure matters, Why save money? Why cultivate relationships that require patient investment? Why build cities or raise children, or plant olive trees that will not bear fruit for 15 years? Why honor agreements or keep promises when breaking them might bring immediate pleasure? The Cyrenaics had answers to these questions, arguing that practical wisdom itself was pleasant and that social cooperation usually produced more reliable pleasures than isolation. But their answers often seemed defensive, like special pleading against the obvious implications of their own position. Aristippus himself lived according to his principles with apparent success. He traveled widely, commanded high fees for his teaching, and according to the stories that accumulated around his name, remained cheerfully indifferent to both praise and blame. When asked why he paid courtesans instead of keeping a wife, he said he preferred to possess things rather than be possessed by them. When criticized for flattering the tyrant Dionysius of Syracuse to gain money, he replied that he did not flatter Dionysius for money, but used Dionysius as an occasion for pleasure. He claimed to be equally at ease in luxury and poverty, in palaces and in the street, adjusting effortlessly to whatever circumstance brought pleasure in the moment. But there is something almost tragic in the Cyrenaic position, though they would never have admitted it. To live only for present pleasure requires a kind of constant vigilance, a perpetual readiness to abandon whatever you are doing the moment it ceases to bring immediate satisfaction. It means having no loyalty, no long-term projects, no commitments that transcend the present moment. It means treating every person, every activity, every experience as merely instrumental to pleasure, valuable only insofar as it produces that smooth bodily motion right now. The Cyrenaics believed this made them free, but one might wonder whether it made them lonely. The Cyrenaic school would not survive long after Aristippus. Within a few generations it fragmented into competing sub-schools, each modifying the original doctrine in different ways, trying to solve the problems that immediate hedonism created. Some tried to expand the definition of pleasure, others to include mental pleasures alongside bodily ones. The radical purity of the original position proved difficult to sustain once you tried to actually live it consistently. And yet, for a brief moment in the history of philosophy, someone had dared to say what seems almost undeniable, if you think about it for even a moment, that pleasure feels good, that feeling good is good, and that nothing else can claim to be good in quite the same obvious way. But not all hedonists agreed that pleasure meant indulging every immediate desire. In Athens, a different kind of pleasure seeker was developing a philosophy that would prove far more influential and far more subtle. But not all hedonists agreed that pleasure meant indulging every immediate desire. In Athens, a different kind of pleasure seeker was developing a philosophy that would prove far more influential and far more subtle. In the year 307 before the Common Era, a man named Epicurus purchased a house with a garden on the outskirts of Athens. He was 34 years old, had studied philosophy on the island of Samos, and in various cities across the Greek world, and had come to a conclusion that would have seemed absurd to Aristippus. Most people pursuing pleasure were doing it entirely wrong. The garden, as it came to be known, was not a school in the traditional sense. Epicurus did not charge fees, he did not deliver public lectures in the agora, he did not train students in rhetoric or prepare them for political life. Instead, he created something closer to a commune, a community of friends who lived together, ate together, and pursued philosophy as a daily practice rather than an abstract intellectual exercise. The gate bore an inscription that captures the spirit of the place. "Stranger, here you will do well to tarry. Here our highest good is pleasure." But anyone arriving at the garden expecting lavish banquets and sensual indulgence would have been deeply disappointed. Epicurus himself ate mostly bread and water, with a bit of cheese on special occasions. His followers lived simply, avoiding political engagement, refusing marriage in most cases, and spending their days in quiet conversation about physics, ethics, and the nature of the gods. When critics accused Epicurus of promoting debauchery, his defenders could point to the man himself, frugal, temperate, suffering from kidney stones that caused him chronic pain, yet insisting until his final days that the pleasure of philosophical friendship outweighed all physical suffering. The apparent contradiction dissolves once you understand what Epicurus meant by pleasure. He was not interested in the intense, fleeting satisfactions that Aristippus celebrated. Instead, Epicurus distinguished between two fundamental types of pleasure, kinetic and katastatic. Kinetic pleasure is pleasure in motion, the active satisfaction of a desire, the taste of wine when you are thirsty, the warmth of a fire when you are cold, the pleasure of eating when you are hungry. These pleasures are real, Epicurus acknowledged, but they are inherently unstable. They require constant renewal. The wine glass empties, the fire burns down, hunger returns. Katastatic pleasure, by contrast, is the pleasure of a stable condition, of equilibrium. It is the pleasure of not being thirsty, not being cold, not being hungry. It is in essence the absence of pain and disturbance. Where Aristippus saw the absence of pain as a neutral state, neither good nor bad, Epicurus identified it as the highest form of pleasure itself. He called this state ataraxia, a word that means something like tranquility or imperturbability, a mind undisturbed by anxiety or desire. This seems like a strange definition of pleasure until you consider it from the inside. Think of a moment when you were genuinely at peace, when your body was comfortable, your immediate needs met, your mind free from worry or craving. That state, Epicurus argued, is not the absence of pleasure, but its perfection. Once you have reached ataraxia, you cannot increase the pleasure, only vary it. The problem, he believed, is that most people never experience this state because they are constantly chasing kinetic pleasures, constantly stirring up new desires, constantly disturbing their own equilibrium. This is why Epicurus advocated for simple living. It was not about moral virtue or spiritual purification. It was a practical strategy for maximizing pleasure. The fewer desires you have, the easier they are to satisfy. The more easily satisfied your desires, the less vulnerable you are to frustration, anxiety, and pain. Luxury, Epicurus observed, breeds dependence. The person who requires fine food, expensive wine, and elaborate entertainment to feel pleasure has created for themselves a precarious happiness that can collapse at any moment. The person who takes pleasure in bread and water, who can be happy with conversation and sunlight, has achieved a kind of invulnerability. Friendship occupied a central place in Epicurean philosophy, but not for sentimental reasons. Epicurus believed that friendship was the most reliable source of lasting pleasure available to human beings. Unlike romantic love, which brings turbulence and anxiety, unlike family, which involves obligation and conflict, friendship offers companionship without possessiveness, support without expectation, pleasure without pain. In the garden, friendships were cultivated with the same care that others might devote to accumulating wealth or pursuing honor. Epicurus wrote that it is not so much our friends' help that helps us as the confidence of their help. Philosophy itself was not merely a path to pleasure, but a form of pleasure in its own right. Epicurus compared philosophy to medicine. Just as medicine heals the body, philosophy heals the soul. He identified 4 great sources of human anxiety that philosophy could cure: fear of the gods, fear of death, fear that pleasure is unattainable, fear that pain is unbearable. His physics, borrowed largely from the atomist Democritus, addressed the first 2 fears. If the universe is made of atoms moving through void, if everything including the soul is material and dissipates at death, then there is nothing to fear in death itself. You will not experience non-existence because there will be no you to experience anything. As Epicurus put it in his letter to Menoetius, death is nothing to us, since when we are, death has not come, and when death has come, we are not. The Epicurean gods deserve particular attention because they reveal something essential about the philosophy. Epicurus did not deny the existence of gods. Instead, he reimagined them completely. The gods, he argued, live in the spaces between worlds, perfectly happy, perfectly tranquil, utterly unconcerned with human affairs. They do not punish the wicked or reward the virtuous. They do not answer prayers. They do not create hurricanes or cause earthquakes. They simply exist in a state of perpetual ataraxia, models of what pleasure looks like when perfected. This was not atheism disguised as theology. Epicurus genuinely believed humans should contemplate the gods, should meditate on their perfect happiness. but the liberation came from recognizing that these beings had no interest in us whatsoever. The fear of divine punishment, the anxiety of trying to appease capricious deities, the whole elaborate apparatus of religious dread could simply be set aside. The irony, of course, is that Epicureanism became synonymous in later centuries with exactly the kind of indulgence Epicurus rejected. The word Epicurean now suggests someone devoted to fine food, expensive wine, and sensual refinement. This misunderstanding was already taking root in Epicurus's own lifetime. His enemies spread rumors about orgies in the garden, about Epicurus vomiting twice a day from overeating, about secret pleasures hidden behind walls. The Roman writer Cicero, centuries later, would use Epicurus as shorthand for degeneracy and moral corruption. Even today, you will find philosophers who treat Epicureanism as crude hedonism barely distinguishable from the Cyrenaics. But the historical Epicurus wrote over 300 works, built a philosophical community that lasted for centuries, and developed a sophisticated account of physics, ethics, and psychology. He died in 270 before the Common Era, reportedly in a warm bath, in terrible pain from his kidney stones, writing letters to friends about the pleasure of their companionship, which he claimed outweighed all bodily suffering. His last instructions were to continue the philosophical work of the garden, to keep alive the simple truth he had spent his life teaching, that happiness does not require much, that most of what we think we need is unnecessary, that peace of mind is both the beginning and the end of the good life. While Epicurus was cultivating his garden in Athens, far to the east, another philosophical tradition was emerging that would take the opposite path entirely, arguing that pleasure was not the solution to human suffering, but its very cause. While Epicurus was cultivating his garden in Athens, far to the east, another philosophical tradition was emerging that would take the opposite path entirely, arguing that pleasure was not the solution to human suffering, but its very cause. Yet this tradition would ultimately reject both the hedonists' embrace of pleasure and the ascetics' war against the body, proposing instead something far more subtle and psychologically profound. The man who would articulate this middle path was born Siddhartha Gautama, around 563 years before the Common Era, in what is now Nepal. His early life reads almost like a philosophical thought experiment designed to test the limits of hedonism. Siddhartha's father, a wealthy ruler, had received a prophecy that his son would become either a great king or a great spiritual teacher. Determined to prevent the latter, he constructed an environment of such complete luxury and pleasure that his son would never feel the need to seek anything beyond the material world. The young Siddhartha lived in 3 palaces, one for each season, surrounded by musicians, dancers, and every conceivable comfort. He was married young to a beautiful woman, shielded from any sight of old age, sickness, or death. His father essentially created a perfect Cyrenaic world, where present pleasure was abundant and suffering remained invisible. If hedonism could satisfy the human spirit, Siddhartha should have been content, but something was deeply wrong. The pleasures his father provided felt hollow, and their very abundance seemed to expose rather than conceal some fundamental problem with existence itself. At age 29, Siddhartha encountered what Buddhist tradition calls the 4 sights: an old man, a sick man, a corpse, and a wandering ascetic. These glimpses of suffering shattered his gilded cage. Here was the truth his father's hedonism had tried to hide, that all pleasure is temporary, that bodies age and sicken, that death waits at the end of every indulgence. The pleasure-seeking life suddenly appeared not as wisdom, but as desperate distraction from truths too painful to face. Siddhartha's response was dramatic and absolute. He abandoned his palaces, his wife, his infant son, and walked into the forest to join the ascetics. If pleasure was the problem, then perhaps its opposite was the solution. For 6 years, he practiced extreme self-mortification, with an intensity that impressed even hardened ascetics. He reduced his food intake until he was eating a single grain of rice per day. He held his breath until he passed out. He slept on thorns. He pushed his body to the absolute edge of survival, believing that punishing the flesh would free the spirit. This is where the Buddha's journey becomes philosophically crucial, because he discovered something that neither Aristippus nor Epicurus fully grasped, and something that later Christian ascetics would never quite accept. Extreme asceticism did not solve the problem of suffering. In fact, it made things worse. Starving and torturing his body did not lead to enlightenment. Instead, it clouded his mind, weakened his concentration, and left him obsessed with his own physical suffering in exactly the way hedonism left people obsessed with physical pleasure. The content had changed, but the fundamental problem remained. He was still trapped in reactivity to bodily sensation. Siddhartha nearly died from his ascetic practices. According to legend, he fainted while bathing and was saved by accepting milk rice from a young woman named Sujata. In that moment of weakness, he had a realization that would transform not just his own practice but the entire philosophical landscape of Asia. Both hedonism and asceticism were extremes, and extremes were themselves the problem. They were not opposites but mirrors, each an overreaction to the human relationship with pleasure and pain. This insight became the foundation of what the Buddha would call the middle way. It was not a compromise between extremes or a moderate indulgence in pleasure. It was a recognition that the entire framework was wrong. The question was not how much pleasure to pursue or how much pain to inflict, but how to transform one's relationship to both. The problem was not pleasure itself, nor the body that experienced it, but something deeper and more psychological, tanha, usually translated as craving or thirst. Tanha is the mind's compulsive grasping at pleasant experiences and pushing away of unpleasant ones. It is the desperate quality and desire, the sense that happiness depends on getting what you want and avoiding what you do not. The hedonist operates entirely within tanha, believing that satisfaction comes from successfully obtaining desired objects. The extreme ascetic also operates within tanha, believing that satisfaction comes from successfully suppressing desire. Both remain trapped in the same fundamental delusion, that peace comes from winning a war against present experience. The Buddha's Four Noble Truths systematized this insight. First, that suffering is inherent in existence. Second, that suffering arises from craving and attachment. Third, that there exists a state beyond suffering. Fourth, that this state is reached through a specific path of practice. Notice what is not being claimed here. The Buddha is not saying pleasure is evil or that the body must be punished. He is making a precise psychological observation that the compulsive pursuit of pleasure and avoidance of pain creates a kind of mental suffering that persists regardless of whether you get what you want. You can see this in your own experience. Even when you obtain a desired pleasure, the mind almost immediately begins worrying about losing it or seeking the next pleasure. Even when you successfully avoid a pain, you remain anxious about its possible return. The hedonic treadmill is not just a modern psychological discovery. The Buddha described it with remarkable precision 2,500 years ago, and his solution was neither to run faster on the treadmill nor to destroy it, but to step off entirely. This stepping off is nirvana, a term so often misunderstood in Western reception that it has become almost meaningless. Nirvana is not a place, not heaven, not oblivion. It is the extinction of tanha, the cessation of that compulsive grasping and pushing that characterizes ordinary consciousness. It exists beyond the pleasure-pain dichotomy entirely, not because pleasure and pain cease to arise, but because the mind no longer clings to one or recoils from the other. You experience sensations without the desperate overlay of craving and aversion that normally accompanies them. Buddhist practice is essentially training in this transformation of desire itself. Meditation is not about feeling good or achieving blissful states, though such states may arise. It is about developing a capacity to observe craving as it emerges, to see its nature clearly, and to allow it to pass without acting on it or identifying with it. Over time, this practice is meant to weaken the grip of tanha until the mind rests in a natural equanimity that neither seeks pleasure nor fears pain. This is radically different from both Cyrenaic hedonism and the mortification of the Desert Fathers to come. It is not anti-pleasure in the way asceticism is, because it does not believe pleasure is evil or corrupting. Neither is it pro-pleasure in the way hedonism is, because it does not believe pleasure provides lasting satisfaction. It occupies a philosophical space that transcends the entire debate by questioning its fundamental assumptions about desire, satisfaction, and the nature of human flourishing. Buddhism would eventually influence Western thought, but in the Mediterranean world, A different form of asceticism was emerging from the deserts of Egypt, one that would shape European consciousness for over 1,000 years. In the 4th century, as Buddhism's middle way was spreading across Asia, a radically different response to pleasure was taking shape in the deserts of Egypt. This was not the careful balance the Buddha advocated, not transcendence beyond the duality of pleasure and pain. This was war, total, uncompromising, lifelong war against the flesh itself. Around the year 271, a young man named Antony stood in a church in the village of Coma, near the Nile, and heard a reading from the Gospel of Matthew. The words struck him with the force of personal command. "If you would be perfect, go sell what you possess and give to the poor, and you will have treasure in heaven." Antony was perhaps 20 years old. His parents had recently died, leaving him a substantial estate and the responsibility for a younger sister. Within days, he had given away his 300 acres of fertile land, placed his sister in a community of virgins, and walked into the Egyptian desert, carrying nothing. He would not return to civilization for 85 years. What Antony did in that desert would reshape Western spirituality for over a millennium. But to understand why he did it, why thousands would follow him into those brutal wastelands, we must understand the theological architecture that made such extreme denial not merely acceptable but spiritually necessary. Christianity had inherited from Judaism the concept of a good creation, a world made by a beneficent God and declared good. Yet it had also developed a narrative of catastrophic rupture. In the Garden of Eden, the first humans had chosen disobedience, and that choice had corrupted not just their souls but their very bodies. The flesh itself had become enemy territory, occupied by sin, a constant source of temptation pulling the soul away from God. This was fundamentally different from the Buddhist understanding. The Buddha saw desire as ignorance, a misunderstanding of reality that caused suffering but could be corrected through wisdom and practice. For the Christian Desert Fathers, bodily desire was not mere ignorance. It was evidence of humanity's fallen state, proof that something essential in human nature had been broken. The body wanted things that would destroy the soul. Pleasure itself, particularly sensual pleasure, was suspect because it reminded humans of their animal nature, their distance from the divine. Paul of Tarsus had written that the flesh wars against the spirit, and the spirit against the flesh. This was not metaphor. In the theology developing in the early church, Satan himself worked primarily through the body, through its hungers and its pleasures, to claim human souls. To deny the body, then, was not self-hatred but spiritual combat. Every denied meal, every sleepless night, every moment of physical discomfort was a battle won against demonic forces. Antony's biography, written by Athanasius of Alexandria, became a manual for this warfare. Alone in an abandoned fort in the desert, Antony faced what the text describes as demonic assaults. Devils appeared to him as wild beasts, as seductive women, as old friends bearing food. They beat him until he was left unconscious. They whispered that his sacrifices were meaningless, that he should return to the world. The biography presents these as literal supernatural attacks, but their psychological reality is undeniable. A young man, alone in brutal conditions, starving and sleep-deprived, would indeed face visions and voices. What is remarkable is that this was precisely the point. The hallucinations were not side effects of ascetic practice, but proof of its effectiveness, evidence that the spiritual realm was responding to his challenge. The practices that emerged from this theology were methodical and severe. Fasting was perhaps the most fundamental. Antony ate once a day after sunset, and then only bread, salt, and water. Other monks went further, fasting for days at a time, or eating only enough to prevent death. The goal was not health or even survival, but the weakening of the flesh's power over the spirit. A hungry body was a distracted body, too weakened to generate strong desires. Sleep deprivation served similar purposes. The night was considered particularly dangerous, the time when the body's desires grew strongest and demons prowled most freely. Many desert fathers slept only a few hours, often sitting upright to prevent deep rest. Some would stand all night in prayer, or immerse themselves in cold water to stay awake. The resulting exhaustion created a state of consciousness neither fully awake nor truly asleep, a liminal space where the boundaries between physical and spiritual seemed to thin. Celibacy was absolute and lifelong. Sexual desire was seen as perhaps the most powerful weapon in Satan's arsenal, the pleasure most capable of diverting the soul from God. But the Desert Fathers understood that simply abstaining from sexual activity was not enough. Desire itself had to be rooted out. Monks avoided looking at women entirely. They avoided bathing when possible. As attention to the body might awaken sexual awareness, some went to extraordinary lengths. Simeon Stylites, a 5th century Syrian ascetic, lived for 37 years on top of a pillar, in part to remove himself entirely from the possibility of sexual temptation. Physical mortification took many forms. Some monks wore chains or heavy iron collars, others refused to cut their hair or nails for years. Macarius of Alexandria, trying to outdo a rival in asceticism, stood naked in a swamp for 6 months, allowing his body to be devoured by insects until he was barely recognizable. These were not the actions of madmen, not in the context of their theological framework. If the body was the primary obstacle to divine union, if it was literally occupied by demonic forces, then its systematic destruction made perfect sense. The pain was the point. Suffering in this life was purification, burning away the corruption of the fall, preparing the soul for eventual reunion with God. Thousands fled to the Egyptian desert in the 4th and 5th centuries. They lived in caves, in abandoned tombs, in crude huts scattered across the wasteland. Communities formed around particularly revered ascetics. People came seeking wisdom, seeking salvation, seeking something that the pleasures and comforts of civilization clearly could not provide. What drove them? Partly genuine religious conviction, certainly, but also, perhaps, a profound dissatisfaction with ordinary life, with its compromises and mediocrity. The desert offered clarity. In that harsh landscape stripped of every comfort, the question of existence became simple and urgent. Would the soul survive the body's death? Everything depended on that question, and the Desert Fathers believed they had found the answer. Destroy the body's power now, suffer voluntarily in this life, and you would be rewarded eternally in the next. Here was the crucial difference between Buddhist and Christian asceticism. Both traditions involved extreme denial of bodily pleasure, but their logic pointed in opposite directions. Buddhist practice aimed at transcendence, at rising above the dualities of pleasure and pain to reach a state where neither had power over consciousness. The goal was escape from the cycle entirely, the extinguishing of desire at its root. Christian asceticism, by contrast, was purification through suffering. The flesh had to be punished, had to be made to suffer, because only through suffering could it be redeemed. The Christian ascetic did not seek to transcend the body, but to defeat it, to break its will, and force it into submission to the spirit. This distinction mattered profoundly in practice. Buddhist monks practiced moderation in their asceticism, having learned from the Buddha's own experience that extreme self-denial could be as much an obstacle as indulgence. Christian Desert Fathers saw moderation as compromise, as a failure of will. They competed in suffering, each trying to outdo the others in the severity of their practices. The literature of the Desert Fathers is full of stories of spectacular self-denial, told with a mix of admiration and almost athletic appreciation. Who could fast longest? Who could stand in prayer for the most hours? Who could resist the most extreme temptations? The theology underlying this practice would dominate Western Christianity for over 1,000 years. Monasticism spread from the Egyptian desert to Syria, to Palestine, to Western Europe. Men and women by the hundreds of thousands took vows of poverty, celibacy, and obedience, dedicating their lives to the systematic denial of bodily pleasure. The greatest saints were those who suffered most completely. The most profound wisdom was thought to come from those who had most thoroughly conquered the flesh. For over a millennium, asceticism dominated Western religious life, but even at its height, philosophers were beginning to question whether denying the body truly brought humans closer to the good. For over a millennium, the Desert Fathers and their monastic descendants had won the philosophical argument. Pleasure was suspect. The body was fallen. Virtue meant restraint, discipline, mortification. But beneath this dominant narrative, something was stirring in the rubble of classical civilization. In 1417, An Italian book hunter named Poggio Bracciolini was searching through a German monastery when he discovered a manuscript that had survived untouched for nearly 1,000 years. It was Lucretius's On the Nature of Things, a Roman poem that explained Epicurean philosophy in verse. Within decades, copies were circulating throughout Europe. Educated men and women were reading, for the first time in centuries, a coherent argument that pleasure was not sinful but natural, that the gods did not punish human enjoyment, that death was nothing to fear, and that the purpose of life was tranquility and joy. The rediscovery changed nothing immediately. Christian theology still dominated universities and political power, but it planted a seed of doubt. If ancient philosophers, men of obvious wisdom and learning, had believed pleasure was good, could the Desert Fathers have been entirely correct? The question became urgent during the Renaissance, as scholars recovered more classical texts and began to see how radically different ancient ethics had been from medieval Christian morality. Michel de Montaigne, writing in his tower in southwestern France in the late 1500s, embodied this shift. He had read Lucretius, Seneca, Plutarch. He had absorbed their acceptance of human nature, their lack of guilt about bodily existence. In his essays, Montaigne wrote with startling frankness about his own body, its digestion, its sexual desires, its pleasures and pains. He defended pleasure as natural and necessary, arguing that to reject the body was to reject the gift of existence itself. When he wrote about sitting by a fire, drinking wine, enjoying a good meal, he was doing something quietly revolutionary, describing physical pleasure without apology, without spiritual justification, simply as part of what it meant to be human. What made Montaigne more than a mere sensualist was his philosophical grounding. He argued that humans who constantly denied their bodies became unbalanced, prone to fanaticism and cruelty. He had witnessed the wars of religion, seen what happened when people believed that purity required the violent suppression of difference. In his view, those who were comfortable with their own bodily nature were gentler with others. Pleasure was not just permissible, it was civilizing. The person who enjoyed a good dinner was less likely to torture heretics than the ascetic who believed his flesh was evil. This rehabilitation of pleasure coincided with the rise of materialist philosophy. René Descartes, despite his famous dualism, helped inadvertently by treating the body as a machine that could be studied scientifically. If the body was mechanism, then perhaps its desires were simply mechanical facts, neither holy nor sinful. Thomas Hobbes went further, arguing in 1651 that humans were entirely material beings, that thoughts and desires were motions in matter, that pleasure and pain were the fundamental motivators of all action. In Hobbes's vision, morality itself arose from the practical need to regulate competing desires, not from divine command. The new anatomy and physiology supported this shift. When William Harvey described the circulation of blood in 1628, he was not writing about pleasure, but he was demonstrating that the body operated according to discoverable laws, not mysterious humors or divine intervention. The more scientists understood about how bodies actually worked, the harder it became to maintain that bodily pleasure was metaphysically dangerous. A stomach digesting food, nerves transmitting sensation, muscles contracting in pleasure, these were natural processes, explicable through observation and reason. By the 18th century, Enlightenment philosophers were arguing explicitly that pleasure was not just acceptable but foundational to ethics and politics. The French materialists, Julien Offray de la Mettrie, Claude Adrien Helvetius, Baron d'Holbach, built entire philosophical systems on the premise that humans were pleasure-seeking, pain-avoiding machines, and that morality meant organizing society to maximize pleasure and minimize suffering. La Mettrie scandalized Europe by arguing in 1748 that the soul was material, that moral goodness meant health and happiness, and that a person who enjoyed sensual pleasure was simply following nature's design. This was more than abstract philosophy. The political implications were profound. If pleasure was natural and good, then why should the church or the state restrict it? Why should laws enforce ascetic morality? The hedonistic revival fed directly into arguments for individual liberty, religious tolerance, and limits on state power. John Locke, though no hedonist himself, built his political philosophy on the protection of life, liberty, and property, and property meant, in part, the security to pursue one's own happiness without interference. There was resistance, of course. Jean-Jacques Rousseau argued that civilization itself had corrupted natural pleasure, turning it into decadence and artificial desire. Immanuel Kant insisted that morality meant acting from duty, not pleasure, and that treating pleasure as the good reduced humans to mere animals. The debate was fierce precisely because the stakes were so high. If Epicurus was right, then 1,000 years of Christian moral teaching had been wrong about something fundamental. Yet the momentum was clear. By 1776, Thomas Jefferson could write that the pursuit of happiness was a self-evident right, a phrase that would have bewildered a medieval theologian. Happiness, not salvation, not purity, not mortification, but happiness, was becoming the acknowledged purpose of human life and the proper concern of political philosophy. The ascetics had not disappeared, but they were fighting a rearguard action against a culture increasingly convinced that pleasure mattered, that bodies were not enemies, and that the good life meant flourishing in this world, not escaping it. By the 18th and 19th centuries, pleasure was no longer just philosophically respectable. It was becoming the foundation for entirely new ethical systems that claimed to calculate human good with mathematical precision. By the 18th and 19th centuries, pleasure was no longer just philosophically respectable. It was becoming the foundation for entirely new ethical systems that claimed to calculate human good with mathematical precision. In London, in 1789, a peculiar lawyer named Jeremy Bentham published a book with an unwieldy title, Introduction to the Principles of Morals and Legislation. Bentham was not interested in whether pleasure was good for the individual soul. He wanted to know whether it could serve as the basis for law, for government, for the organization of society itself. His answer was extraordinary in its confidence. Not only could pleasure serve as the foundation for ethics and politics, it was the only possible foundation. Everything else, Bentham argued, was mystification and nonsense on stilts. Bentham's central insight was deceptively simple. Nature, he wrote, has placed mankind under the governance of two sovereign masters, pain and pleasure. They alone determine what we ought to do, as well as what we shall do. Every human action, every choice, every policy could be evaluated by a single standard. Did it increase pleasure and decrease pain? If it did, it was good. If it did not, it was bad. There was nothing else to consider. This was hedonism, but hedonism transformed. The Cyrenaics had pursued their own immediate pleasure. Epicurus had sought tranquil pleasure for himself and his friends. Bentham proposed something far more ambitious, the greatest happiness for the greatest number. Pleasure was still the good, but now it was collective pleasure, measurable pleasure, pleasure that could be weighed and calculated and used to make decisions that affected millions. To make this work, Bentham developed what he called the hedonic calculus, a method for quantifying pleasure and pain. Every pleasure could be measured along 7 dimensions: its intensity, its duration, its certainty or uncertainty, its propinquity or remoteness in time, its fecundity or likelihood of producing further pleasures, its purity or freedom from accompanying pain, and its extent or the number of people affected. Add up the pleasures and subtract the pains, and you would know mathematically which action was right. The audacity of this project is difficult to overstate. Bentham genuinely believed that moral questions could be solved like arithmetic problems. Should we build a new hospital or a new prison? Calculate the pleasure and pain each would produce. Should we legalize a particular activity? Measure its hedonic consequences. The rightness or wrongness of any action was not a matter of intuition, tradition, or divine command. It was a matter of calculation. Bentham was not merely a theorist. He designed prisons, proposed legal reforms, and campaigned for social changes ranging from animal rights to the decriminalization of homosexuality. In each case, his reasoning was utilitarian. Does this practice increase suffering? Then it is wrong, regardless of tradition or religious teaching. Does this reform increase overall happiness? Then it is right, regardless of who benefits or loses. The hedonic calculus was meant to be a tool for social progress, sweeping away the accumulated superstitions of centuries. But there was something unsettling about Bentham's vision, and one of his most brilliant students saw it clearly. John Stuart Mill, born in 1806, was raised as a utilitarian prodigy. His father, James Mill, was Bentham's close friend and disciple. Young John Stuart learned Greek at 3, Latin at 8, and political economy at 13. He was trained from infancy to be the perfect utilitarian, a calculating machine for the greatest happiness. At 20, Mill had a nervous breakdown. The relentless focus on calculation, on treating all pleasures as equivalent units to be summed and compared, had left him emotionally hollow. He recovered by reading poetry, particularly Wordsworth, and discovered what seemed to be missing from Bentham's system. Not all pleasures were equal. Some were simply higher, richer, more deeply human than others. In 1863, Mill published Utilitarianism, a short book that attempted to preserve Bentham's ethical framework while answering its most obvious criticism. Yes, Mill agreed, pleasure was the only good, but pleasures differed in quality as well as quantity. It was better to be a human being dissatisfied than a pig satisfied. Better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a fool satisfied. If the fool or the pig disagreed, that was only because they knew only their own side of the question. The other party to the comparison knew both sides. Mill's distinction between higher and lower pleasures was meant to rescue utilitarianism from vulgarity. It acknowledged what seemed obvious, that intellectual, moral, and aesthetic pleasures were superior to purely bodily ones, but it created as many problems as it solved. Who decides which pleasures are higher? Mill said it should be those who have experienced both kinds, but this seemed suspiciously convenient. The educated classes, who preferred poetry to pushpin, would naturally rank their own pleasures as superior. Was this philosophy or merely prejudice? There was a deeper problem, one that neither Bentham nor Mill fully resolved. Can pleasure actually be measured? When you choose between reading a book and eating a meal, between seeing a friend and taking a walk, are you really comparing quantities of pleasure along 7 dimensions? The hedonic calculus seemed to describe a process that no human mind actually performed. We make choices, certainly, but not by assigning numerical values to competing pleasures and summing them. And if pleasures cannot be measured, how can we calculate the greatest happiness for the greatest number? Suppose a policy benefits 90 people slightly but harms 10 people severely. Is that increase in total happiness? What if the 90 are already comfortable and the 10 are desperate? What if the harm to the 10 is a violation of their basic rights? Utilitarianism seemed to offer clear answers but delivered only more questions. Then there was the tension between individual and collective good. If morality demands maximizing total happiness, you might be required to sacrifice your own deepest desires for others. You might be required to sacrifice your family, your friends, your life projects, whenever doing so would produce a greater sum of pleasure elsewhere. This was not a philosophy of pleasure at all, but a philosophy of endless obligation. The hedonist became a servant to the hedonic calculus. Despite these problems, utilitarianism flourished. It offered something no other ethical system provided, a clear decision procedure that did not depend on religious revelation or metaphysical speculation. You did not need to know the nature of virtue or the commands of God. You needed only to ask what will reduce suffering and increase well-being. This made utilitarianism extraordinarily useful for practical policy, public health decisions, criminal justice reform, economic planning. All could be framed in utilitarian terms. Even today, cost-benefit analysis in government policy is essentially Bentham's hedonic calculus in modern dress. In medicine, utilitarian thinking guides triage decisions and resource allocation. In economics, it shapes arguments about taxation and welfare. In animal ethics, it grounds arguments against factory farming and animal experimentation. Peter Singer, perhaps the most influential living utilitarian, has used Bentham's logic to argue that species membership is morally irrelevant, that what matters is only the capacity to suffer. Utilitarianism turned hedonism into a weapon for reform, yet the criticisms have never been fully answered. Can we really reduce human well-being to a single metric? Does maximizing total happiness sometimes require terrible injustices? Is there something inhuman about treating moral decisions as optimization problems? These questions have generated a vast philosophical literature, refinements and variations of utilitarian theory, attempts to preserve its insights while avoiding its pitfalls. Rule utilitarianism, preference utilitarianism, two-level utilitarianism, each trying to solve the puzzles that Bentham's original vision created. What Bentham and Mill accomplished was the transformation of hedonism from a personal philosophy into a public one. They took the ancient claim that pleasure is good and made it the foundation for ethics, law, and social policy. Whether they succeeded is still debated, but they demonstrated that hedonism could be rigorous, systematic, and directed toward the welfare of all rather than the indulgence of one. They made pleasure morally serious. But even as utilitarianism made hedonism respectable, other philosophers were developing profound critiques, arguing that the pursuit of pleasure was fundamentally misguided and that human flourishing required something closer to ascetic denial. Even as utilitarianism made hedonism respectable in the halls of Parliament and the lecture rooms of universities, a very different voice was emerging from Frankfurt. Arthur Schopenhauer had been reading texts that most European philosophers ignored: translations of the Upanishads, accounts of Buddhist philosophy, descriptions of Hindu practices of renunciation, and in these ancient Eastern traditions, he found confirmation of a truth he had already suspected from observing his own life and the lives around him. The pursuit of pleasure was not merely difficult or occasionally disappointing, it was, he concluded, the fundamental error of human existence. Schopenhauer published The World as Will and Representation in 1818, when he was just 30 years old. The book sold poorly. The University of Berlin, where he had hoped to rival Hegel's popularity, scheduled his lectures at the same time as the famous dialecticians' courses. Schopenhauer's classrooms remained empty. He spent much of his life bitter, isolated, living alone in Frankfurt with a succession of poodles, all named Atma, the Sanskrit word for the world soul. His philosophy matched his temperament, dark, uncompromising, and fundamentally at odds with the optimism of his age. At the heart of Schopenhauer's system lies a radical metaphysical claim: the world that we perceive, the world of objects and causes, of space and time and individual things, is mere representation. It is, borrowing from Kant, a construction of our cognitive apparatus. We do not see reality as it is. We see only how reality appears to minds like ours. But behind this veil of representation, behind the world as we experience it, lies something else. This will is not your will or my will. It is not conscious intention or rational choice. It is a blind, striving force that animates all existence. The will drives the plant towards sunlight, compels the animal to hunt, pushes the river toward the sea. In humans, it becomes conscious of itself, and this consciousness transforms everything. We do not simply strive like other creatures. We know that we strive, feel that we strive, and suffer from the eternal dissatisfaction that striving brings. Here is where Schopenhauer's asceticism takes root. Every desire, he argues, is experienced as a lack, a deficiency, a wanting. When you are hungry, you suffer from hunger. When you achieve satisfaction, when you eat, the pleasure lasts only a moment before new desires arise. You become thirsty. You grow tired. You want companionship, recognition, security, novelty. The satisfaction of desire never brings lasting peace because the will itself is insatiable. It has no goal, no purpose, no endpoint. It simply wills, endlessly, pointlessly, creating suffering wherever it becomes conscious. The hedonists, in Schopenhauer's view, had made a catastrophic error. They believed pleasure was a positive state, something that could be pursued and attained. But pleasure, he insisted, is merely the temporary cessation of pain. It is negative, not positive. When you satisfy hunger, you do not create pleasure so much as remove the pain of hunger. The baseline state of existence is suffering. What we call pleasure is just the brief absence of a particular suffering, a momentary lull before the will generates new desires and new pains. This was not mere pessimistic speculation. Schopenhauer had absorbed the Buddhist teaching that life is dukkha, usually translated as suffering but more accurately understood as unsatisfactoriness or dissatisfaction. He saw the same truth in the Hindu concept of Maya, the illusion of the phenomenal world. The utilitarians were trying to maximize something that did not truly exist. The Cyrenaics were chasing shadows. Even Epicurus, with his careful distinction between necessary and unnecessary desires, had not gone far enough. The problem was not wrong desires. The problem was desire itself. But if life is suffering and desire is the cause, what can be done? Schopenhauer offered two paths, both involving escape from the will's tyranny. The first is temporary, aesthetic contemplation. When you stand before a beautiful painting, lose yourself in music, or gaze at a mountain landscape, something shifts. For a moment you stop willing, you stop wanting, you become pure perceiving consciousness, absorbed completely in the object of contemplation. The will falls silent. You experience what Schopenhauer calls the Platonic idea, the eternal form of things, freed from the prison of space, time, and causation. Artists and philosophers can achieve this state more readily than others, but it remains available to anyone capable of genuine aesthetic experience. This aesthetic escape, however, is temporary. The will always returns. You cannot spend your entire life in contemplation. Eventually, hunger reasserts itself. Fatigue demands rest. Anxiety creeps back in. For permanent liberation, Schopenhauer points to a second path, ascetic denial of the will itself. This is where he becomes the most rigorous ascetic in Western philosophy. The Christian monks denied the flesh to purify the soul for God. The Buddhists sought to extinguish craving to achieve nirvana. Schopenhauer goes further. He argues that the distinction between self and other is itself part of the illusion of representation. At the deepest level, there is only the will, expressing itself in countless individual forms. Your suffering and my suffering are ultimately the same suffering. Compassion, he suggests, arises when we see through individuation to this underlying unity. The true ascetic, in Schopenhauer's vision, stops affirming the will to live. Through practices of self-denial, through fasting, celibacy, poverty, and renunciation, the ascetic weakens the will's grip. This is not suicide, which Schopenhauer explicitly rejects as a violent assertion of will. The suicide wants life to be different. The ascetic accepts life as it is and chooses to stop willing altogether. Eventually, if the practice is complete, the will turns against itself and achieves what Schopenhauer calls the denial of the will to live. What lies beyond this denial, he admits, is unknowable. It is nothingness from the perspective of the world as representation, but it may be something entirely different from the perspective of those who achieve it. You can hear the Buddha in this, the echoes of Hindu renunciation, the Christian mystic's dark night of the soul, but you can also hear something uniquely modern, a philosopher using European metaphysics to arrive at conclusions that would have been at home in a Tibetan monastery. Schopenhauer built a bridge between East and West, between religious asceticism and philosophical pessimism. His influence would be profound. Nietzsche read Schopenhauer as a young man, and initially embraced his pessimism before rejecting it as a form of weakness, a denial of life that Nietzsche found contemptible. Yet Nietzsche never stopped wrestling with Schopenhauer's ideas, never stopped trying to formulate an alternative that affirmed existence without falling into naive optimism. Freud, too, absorbed Schopenhauer's teaching that consciousness is merely the surface of a deeper, irrational driving force. The unconscious ideas in psychoanalytic theory bears a striking resemblance to Schopenhauer's will. 20th century existentialists from Sartre to Camus encountered in Schopenhauer a philosopher who faced the apparent meaninglessness of existence without flinching and without resorting to easy consolations. Schopenhauer died in 1860, still relatively obscure but beginning to attract serious readers. In his final years, his work started to find the audience it had lacked decades earlier. Perhaps the world had caught up to his pessimism. Perhaps the confident progressivism of early 19th century thought was beginning to show cracks. Or perhaps some truths simply take time to be heard. Schopenhauer's bleak vision represented perhaps the most extreme form of philosophical asceticism in the West, but in the 20th century, thinkers began to question whether the entire debate had been framed incorrectly from the beginning. Schopenhauer's vision of life as endless suffering to be escaped through ascetic denial represented perhaps the most extreme philosophical rejection of the body in Western thought. But even as his influence spread through European intellectual circles in the late 1800s, something curious was happening. The very extremity of his position was beginning to provoke a backlash, not just against asceticism, but against the entire framework that made people choose between pleasure and denial in the first place. What if the real problem was not which side to take in this ancient war, but the assumption that these were the only two options? Friedrich Nietzsche, born in 1844 in the small Saxon town of Rücken, spent his early philosophical career deeply under Schopenhauer's spell. He read the world as will and representation as a young man, and found in it a thrilling darkness, a willingness to stare at life's suffering without flinching. But by the time Nietzsche reached intellectual maturity, he had come to see something disturbing in both his former hero's asceticism and in the hedonistic alternatives that opposed it. Both positions, he argued, were symptoms of the same underlying sickness, a fundamental inability to affirm life as it actually is. In his 1887 work on the genealogy of morals, Nietzsche offered a diagnosis that cut in both directions. The ascetic ideal, he wrote, was not really about transcending the body or reaching some higher truth. It was about finding a reason for suffering. Human beings can endure tremendous pain, Nietzsche observed, but what they cannot endure is meaningless pain. The ascetic priest offered meaning. Your suffering is not random. It is purification, punishment, discipline, a path to something better. The desert father starving in his cave and the Buddhist monk sitting motionless through days of meditation were not discovering truth beyond the body. They were creating a narrative that made their suffering bearable by claiming it led somewhere. But hedonism fared no better in Nietzsche's analysis. The person who lives only for pleasure, he argued, reveals the same fundamental inability to accept existence. Pleasure-seeking is flight, just as surely as ascetic denial. It is the flight from difficulty, from challenge, from anything that might demand growth or transformation. The hedonist and the ascetic both say no to life as it is. One says, life is suffering, I will escape through denial. The other says, life is suffering, I will escape through distraction and indulgence. Neither can simply be present to existence without needing it to be different. What Nietzsche proposed instead was neither pleasure nor denial, but something he called amor fati, love of fate. Could you love your life so completely that you would will to live it again, exactly as it is, eternally? Not the pleasant parts, not an edited version. Everything, the pain, the failure, the embarrassment, the loss, and not just endure it, but actively want it. This was not hedonism, because it did not seek pleasure. It was not asceticism, because it did not reject the body. It was a third option that Western philosophy had barely begun to explore, radical acceptance of embodied existence in all its complexity. In the 20th century, this line of thinking found new expression in phenomenology, particularly in the work of Maurice Merleau-Ponty. Born in 1908 in Rochefort-sur-Mer, Merleau-Ponty spent his philosophical career trying to overcome what he saw as the false dichotomy between mind and body that had plagued Western thought since Plato. The entire debate between hedonism and asceticism, he might have argued, rested on a mistake, the idea that we are minds that happen to have bodies, rather than beings for whom embodiment is fundamental. In his 1945 work, Phenomenology of Perception, Merleau-Ponty described the body not as an object that the mind controls or must transcend, but as our primary way of being in the world. You do not have a body the way you have a car. You are your body. Consciousness itself, he argued, is embodied. The question is not whether to embrace bodily pleasure or reject it. The question is how to live as the fundamentally embodied beings that we are. This perspective made the traditional debate look strange. The hedonist and the ascetic both treat the body as something external to the self, something to be either indulged or controlled. But if embodiment is fundamental to who you are, then neither pure indulgence nor pure denial makes sense. You cannot indulge yourself as though your body were a separate thing deserving rewards. You cannot deny yourself as though your body were an enemy to be defeated. You can only live as an embodied consciousness, making choices about how to be in the world. Michel Foucault, writing in the late 20th century, approached the same territory from a different angle. In his final works, particularly The History of Sexuality, volumes 2 and 3, Foucault examined ancient Greek and Roman practices of self-cultivation. What interested him was not whether these practices involved pleasure or denial, but how they functioned as what he called technologies of the self, techniques through which people shaped their own existence. An ancient Roman practicing dietary moderation, Foucault argued, was not really choosing asceticism over hedonism. He was cultivating a particular relationship with himself, a form of self-mastery that was about autonomy, not denial. The point was not to reject pleasure, but to be free in relation to it, to choose when and how to engage rather than being driven by appetite. Similarly, an Epicurean cultivating simple pleasures was not just seeking pleasure, but developing a way of being that gave him independence from fortune and circumstance. This reframing dissolved the binary. The question was not pleasure or denial, but what kind of person you were becoming through your practices, and whether those practices increased or decreased your freedom. Meanwhile, in the domain of virtue ethics, philosophers were reviving Aristotelian ideas that had never quite fit the hedonism-asceticism debate. Aristotle had argued in the Nicomachean Ethics that pleasure was not the goal of life, but that a life well lived would naturally be pleasant. The virtuous person, he claimed, takes pleasure in virtuous action not because pleasure is the goal, but because her character has been shaped such that doing the right thing feels good. This was neither hedonism nor asceticism. It suggested that if you are asking whether to seek pleasure or deny it, you are already looking at life wrong. The real question is what kind of character to cultivate. Pleasure then becomes a symptom of living well, not a goal to pursue or an enemy to flee. Modern psychological research has, perhaps surprisingly, tended to support these more complex perspectives. Studies of subjective well-being consistently find that pleasure-seeking alone does not produce lasting happiness. The hedonic treadmill means that each pleasure requires increasing intensity to produce the same satisfaction, but extreme asceticism produces its own pathologies: depression, anxiety, obsessive control. What emerges from decades of research is that human flourishing seems to require something more subtle than either pole offers: meaningful engagement, autonomy, competence, connection with others, and yes, appropriate pleasure that arises from activities that matter. The debate persists today, but in forms that reveal its enduring hold on human consciousness. Addiction is hedonism that has escaped control, proving the limits of pleasure-seeking. Consumerism is the promise that the right purchase will finally satisfy, a distorted echo of Epicurean moderation. The mindfulness movement draws on Buddhist practice, but often strips away the ascetic framework, trying to find presence without denial. We are still wrestling with the same question Aristippus and Antony faced: what to do with these bodies, these desires, this hunger that never quite finds its final satisfaction. After thousands of years of debate, we still have not settled the question. Perhaps that is because the tension between pleasure and denial reflects something fundamental about human existence itself. We have travelled through 24 centuries of argument, from Aristippus's pursuit of immediate pleasure to Schopenhauer's radical renunciation, from Epicurus's garden to Anthony's desert cave. We have seen brilliant minds construct elaborate systems proving that pleasure is the highest good, and equally brilliant minds demonstrate with equal certainty that pleasure is the trap from which we must escape. And yet, standing here at the end of this long journey, a peculiar fact emerges: neither side has won. The debate continues, unresolved, in every generation, in every culture that has pondered the question. Perhaps this persistence tells us something more important than any answer either side has offered. Consider what happens when someone actually tries to live as a pure hedonist, pursuing pleasure as the only good worth seeking. The Cyrenaics imagined it could be done, that one could simply move from one pleasant experience to the next, drinking deeply from each moment without thought for tomorrow. But human psychology proves less cooperative than philosophy might wish. The 20th century gave us unprecedented opportunities to test pure hedonism in practice. Never before in history have so many people had such access to pleasure, such freedom to pursue desire wherever it leads. And what we have discovered is that pleasure pursued directly and constantly has a peculiar way of vanishing just as you reach for it. The phenomenon has a name in psychology: hedonic adaptation. The things that bring intense pleasure today become merely adequate tomorrow and barely noticeable next week. The mechanism is relentless. You buy the thing you desperately wanted, and for a few days or weeks it brings genuine joy. Then it becomes simply part of the background of your life, no more noticed than the air you breathe. You achieve the goal you worked toward for years, feel a surge of satisfaction, and within months find yourself restless again, seeking the next achievement. The treadmill never stops. Pure hedonism, it turns out, is self-defeating, not because pleasure is bad, but because the direct pursuit of pleasure destroys the very conditions that make pleasure possible. Pleasure seems to arrive most reliably as a byproduct of other pursuits: engagement with work, deep relationships, creative expression, challenges met and overcome. When you make pleasure itself the goal, it slips away like water through grasping fingers. But asceticism fares no better when taken to its logical extreme. The Desert Fathers believed that mortifying the flesh would bring them closer to God, that suffering was purification, that the body was an enemy to be conquered. Some of them achieved remarkable feats of endurance. Simeon Stylite spent 37 years living atop a pillar in Syria, never coming down, exposed to every weather, eating almost nothing. When he died in 459, people claimed his body had merged with the stone. But what did such extremes actually achieve? Antony of Egypt, for all his decades of self-denial, reported being tormented by vivid hallucinations of feasts and women and comfort. The desires he tried to eliminate through deprivation only grew more intense in his imagination. Modern psychology has given this phenomenon a name too: ironic process theory, or more colloquially, the pink elephant effect. Tell yourself not to think about something, and that thing becomes the only thing you can think about. The ascetic who spends all his energy fighting bodily desire ends up more obsessed with the body than any hedonist, constantly vigilant, constantly battling, never at peace. The very act of denial keeps the denied thing perpetually present. Pure asceticism also produces more subtle pathologies. It can become a form of pride, a way of feeling superior to those weak souls who cannot resist temptation. It can mask depression or self-hatred as spiritual practice. It can lead to a kind of life denial, a refusal to engage fully with the world and its genuine offerings. The ascetic risks becoming so focused on transcendence that he misses the possibility that this world, this body, this life might contain something worth experiencing rather than escaping. When Nietzsche criticized ascetic ideals, he was pointing to something real: that the constant no to life, the perpetual denial, could become its own pathology, a kind of revenge against existence itself. So if neither extreme works, what remains? Perhaps the answer lies in recognizing that human flourishing requires something more complex than a single principle applied uniformly across all circumstances. There may be times when pursuing pleasure is exactly right, when saying yes to experience, to joy, to embodied delight is the most appropriate response to being alive, and there may be times when restraint, discipline, even temporary asceticism serves genuine well-being. The question may not be whether to embrace pleasure or deny it, but when to do each and why. Consider how this might work across a single human life. A young person exploring the world, discovering what brings satisfaction, learning through experience what pleasures are genuine and which are hollow. This person may need periods of experimentation, of saying yes, of finding out what it means to be embodied and desiring. A person in the middle of life, building something, caring for others, engaged in work that demands discipline. This person may need to cultivate the capacity for delay, for choosing long-term goods over immediate satisfaction, for staying with difficulty when pleasure beckons elsewhere. An older person, facing decline, loss, the gradual narrowing of physical capacity. This person may need to develop the art of letting go, of finding sufficiency in less, of making peace with limitation. None of these approaches is wrong. Each fits its context. Culture plays its role too. A society built entirely around pleasure-seeking, around the satisfaction of every desire, around comfort and entertainment and the elimination of all friction, such a society may desperately need ascetic voices, reminding people that some goods require struggle, that not everything worth having comes easily, that the capacity to endure difficulty is itself valuable. But a society steeped in Puritanism, in the glorification of suffering, in the suspicion of joy, such a society may need hedonistic philosophers, arguing that pleasure is not sinful, that the body is not shameful, that saying yes to life is not moral failure. The question is always contextual, always responsive to actual conditions rather than abstract principle. Individual difference matters too, and this is where the debate moves from philosophy to genuine attention to particular human beings. Some people seem constitutionally inclined toward restraint, finding satisfaction in discipline and simplicity. Others are naturally more expansive, more drawn to experience and sensation. Neither type is more virtuous than the other. They are simply different ways of being human, different temperaments navigating the same fundamental questions. What brings one person alive might make another miserable. The ascetic practice that one person finds liberating might be for another a form of self-punishment masquerading as spirituality. The pleasures that one person finds enriching might leave another feeling empty and lost. This is why the debate between hedonism and asceticism is genuinely philosophical rather than merely a matter of personal taste. It asks fundamental questions about what human beings are, what we are for, what constitutes a life well lived. It touches on the nature of desire itself, whether wanting things is the problem or the solution, whether we should trust our inclinations or discipline them into submission. It raises questions about the relationship between immediate experience and long-term well-being, between individual satisfaction and collective flourishing, between the body and whatever we mean when we talk about the soul or the self or consciousness. These are not questions that can be settled by preference or by measuring outcomes. They require ongoing reflection, constant adjustment, attention to context and particularity. The debate will never be fully resolved because it reflects something genuinely paradoxical about human existence. We are animals who transcend animality, bodies that are also somehow more than bodies, creatures caught between immediate sensation and long-term meaning. We are built to desire, to reach for pleasure, to avoid pain. These drives kept our ancestors alive, motivated them to eat and reproduce and seek safety. But we are also capable of imagining goods beyond immediate satisfaction, of choosing difficulty for the sake of future benefit, of finding meaning in struggle and sacrifice. Both capacities are real, both are part of what we are. Any philosophy that honors only one while denying the other will be, to that extent, incomplete. Perhaps the deepest wisdom is not found in choosing one side, but in learning to hold the tension, to recognize that the question itself is more important than any final answer. The person who has never asked whether to pursue pleasure or deny it, who simply drifts through life following every impulse or rigidly suppressing every desire, this person has not yet begun to live philosophically. But the person who asks the question, who feels the pull in both directions, who understands that pleasure can be both gift and trap, that discipline can be both liberation and prison, this person is engaged with something essential. The tension between hedonism and asceticism is not a problem to be solved, but a creative friction that makes fully human life possible. This concludes our exploration of hedonism and asceticism, but the question itself continues in your own life, in every choice between indulgence and restraint, comfort and challenge, the easy path and the difficult one.